Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 174 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions. Today I have back with me Matt Kelly. Matt is the editor of Compliance Week. We visit on a couple of columns that Matt recently wrote and talk about some of the upcoming events that Compliance Week will be sponsoring in Europe and Dubai. The columns deal with Uber, the ruling by the California Labor Commission that one driver from Uber is not a 1099 contractor, but an employee. We also take a look at Dodd-Frank. What are some of the things that are working as a result of Dodd-Frank, and what are some of the market responses that have popped up since that time that Dodd-Frank does not address? The episode comes in at just over 24 minutes. I hope you'll enjoy the episode and look forward to visiting with you next time. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I'm very pleased to have back my good friend, Matt Kelly. Matt is the editor of Compliance Week, and I asked him if he could take a little bit of time from his very busy schedule to come on and talk to us a little bit about some of the things that he has been writing about recently and that are on his mind, and perhaps even give us a preview of some of the exciting things Compliance Week has in store for us in the fall of 2015. So with that somewhat long-winded introduction, Matt, welcome. How's the weather in Boston today?
Hello, Tom. It's good to be here again. And here in Boston, it is actually a quite lovely summer day, which is a rare thing up in our city.
Well, given the winter you had, you deserve lots of them this summer.
Very true, yeah.
Matt, I've really been intrigued by a couple of your blog posts lately. You write a column called The Big Picture, and you write about a lot of different things, and you generally try to tie it into compliance and ethics. And the one that, or I guess the last couple that have intrigued me was, the first one was on Uber and the recent decision from the California Labor Commission about finding that one of the company's independent contractors was in fact an employee. And an earlier one in June was about Dodd-Frank Act and some companies' responses to that. And so your thoughts on how it might be working or how it might not be working. So I was wondering if we might be able to kind of dive into those a little bit.
Sure. I'd be happy maybe to start with Uber, which is probably the more recent and newsworthy thing for most people. As you said, so last week, the California Labor Commission ruled in a decision about a San Diego woman who was an ex-driver of Uber, that the commission ruled that the woman was, in fact, an employee of Uber and therefore entitled to several $1,000s in driver expenses that Uber was saying it did not owe this woman because Uber said it was not a drive or transportation company. It was an information technology business that simply put independent contractor drivers in touch with various people looking for rides. And so Uber was basically saying these people are independent contractors, they are on their own. The Labor Commission ruled that no, this woman was in fact an employee of Uber, had to be treated as such. I think this case is interesting for one or two reasons here. Really, it does get to what I think a lot of people view as the tip of the iceberg for these new economy businesses that are very good at putting people with a need in touch with a person who is going to deliver a service or a product, whether that is, somebody who's looking to hail a ride or get your house cleaned or babysitting services or anything like that. But what really struck me was that Uber, on one hand, seems to be saying it projects a certain impression, a certain brand value to its customers, who are the people looking for rides. And I'm sure if anybody listening has seen or used Uber cars before, they're very clean, they're very slick, they're very good. I don't typically use Uber myself just because I live in a very mass transit type of a city, but I know Uber when I see it. It certainly looks better than a whole lot of taxis here in Boston, and it's easier to use. So Uber clearly depends on the conduct of its drivers and on the drivers fulfilling a lot of different expectations to be an Uber driver. I've seen the contract that you have to sign to be an Uber driver, and it's not simple. And so, at the other hand, they're also saying when it comes to shouldering the cost and expense of that job, well, Uber here, that's not our job. We're just a ride matching service. It gets to the question of how much control a company exerts over culture and conduct. And that's where I think it's interesting for compliance officers, because they are always saying that conduct is so important and good ethical standards are a strategic asset for a company. I think there's still a lot of cynics who might question that. I personally do not. I agree with them that good conduct and high standards are critical to a company's success and to preserving its brand value. But I'm hard-pressed to see how Uber can say that's so important so it can drive up its valuation for for the company's worth. And the company is worth a fortune, according to the investors who've put money into it, but then not shoulder the responsibility for the workers there. And I was about to say employees. I suppose I shouldn't legally, but as the Labor Commission ruled, this woman's her service to Uber is intrinsic to Uber's value. So, of course, she's an employee and should be treated as such.
Before we go any further, let me
Sure.
let me follow up on or break that down a little bit, because you use the phrases conduct and culture. And I think the analysis that the California Labor Commission used focused on conduct, right to control, but even more so actual control.
Mm-hmm.
But you talked about those two functions as something that the compliance officer needs to consider. If we use the conduct argument to really focus on whether or not the person in question was an employee, how does culture fit into that? Or is that really a separate legal analysis?
Well, I think the most accurate answer to that is we don't know. But it is, so I suppose it probably is a separate legal analysis that we'll have to do sometime as a society. And I think that this is not the last time we are going to be confronted with this question. But my point with the column is raising it that if we're talking about the ability to control a worker as the determinant of whether they are an employee or an independent contractor, and we're also talking about how we want culture to be up to high standards, we would like it to be as uniform across the entire enterprise as possible, then, it's fair to say, does that actually in the modern world translate into so much control that it triggers some sort of employee duty? I don't know, but it's worth asking. The Labor Commission certainly thought, yes, it does. It's worth noting that the Labor Commission's ruling applies only to that specific driver, not to Uber drivers as a whole class, not in the country, not in the state of California or anything, just to her. Uber has already appealed this, and it will have to go to a California Superior Court in San Francisco. So we're not done. But my point is that if culture and conduct are going to be so crucial and so overseen by HR, the compliance officer, or anybody, do we almost wind up having a ghost rise up from the machine and you sort of infer employee status out of what you're trying to do? And like I said, I don't know, but it's not an easy question to answer. And anybody who just dismisses it as you're just an independent contractor, I think it flies in the face of political and social reality.
I'm really interested with your focus on the culture of Uber as part of Uber's business value. And that really struck for me something that Tom Friedman wrote in the New York Times, that the 21st century, one of the 21st century business models was having a trusted platform that would deliver a service, information, or something that a customer or consumer of that platform would trust. And I, as a Uber user, and I do try to use Uber at every city I go to, do trust the culture and the service that's being provided to me. You and I might talk about the trust platform in terms of information that we would provide to our readers or our listeners.
Yep.
But it's that platform and what you've laid on as part of the analysis I find fascinating, which is the culture part, because I am buying a culture that I trust through the conduct of its drivers. Very interesting.
I would even compare it perhaps to a very large manufacturing business. You know, a lot of people listening here and who read Compliance Week and listen to you, Tom, they're worried about FCPA enforcement. A big part of FCPA enforcement is third parties acting on your behalf, and regulators have very clearly said that they're throwing sort of a cloak of expectation over the whole enterprise, including other agents who are acting on the company's behalf. Well, that's even if you say Uber drivers are independent contractors, they are acting as agents of Uber. So there is a certain similarity here to what we're talking about, that Walmart wants everybody to know that it is well known for good prices and ethical business practice around the world. I'm not saying all their third parties are also Walmart employees, but it's the same sort of concept that is starting to get fuzzy around the edges. And in Uber's case, I think it's a whole lot more fuzzy. That how much is culture going to wind up being a determinant of your employee status?
That is a really interesting way to look at it. It's certainly not something that was factored into either the IRS analysis, or even if we go back to the start of the 20th century, the workers' compensation analysis as to whether someone was an employee and entitled to workers' compensation benefits, which is where we have derived these tests for employment status from. So
yes.
I've followed this debate pretty closely, and one sort of thing that's come out of it is a call for, should we even revisit these tests? Are they outmoded? Are they outdated? Or can old tests be brought forward to a new economy? And I don't pretend to know the answer to it. I just am or I am with you, that there are many more questions that need to be raised before we can even get to the answers.
It is worth noting that the IRS's current set of tests around employee classification, they were updated, I believe, in 2007 or 2011. Like, Uber didn't exist, even if it was 2011, let alone in 2007. Many of these services that we're going to be confronted with, the IRS's rules may not be compatible with what's coming along.
Right. Very, very interesting. Now if we could turn to something that's a little bit different than Uber, which was a column you wrote on June 1, in fact, entitled How Dodd-Frank is Working and How It Isn't. This has obviously been a topic in the compliance community for some period of time, since 2010 or 2011. You've had Barney Frank was a keynote speaker at Compliance Week, the first one I attended, and of course he talked about Dodd-Frank. But you took a look at a couple of different new business scenarios that have come up. So why don't you walk us through what your thoughts were?
Well, I was thinking of that through the same lens I often think about when people ask if the Sarbanes-Oxley Act from years before, whether or not that works. And, remember what the law was passed to do. Sarbanes-Oxley had been passed to curtail this proliferation of corporate fraud in financial statements. Dodd-Frank was passed to curtail the need for taxpayer bailouts of big banks that have these systemic failures that are just so huge they require taxpayer assistance. And that was it. That was really what the law was about, is to get rid of systemic risk that typically will reside in very large financial operations. There are an awful lot of other things that were included in Dodd-Frank that maybe are noble ideas, like the conflict minerals rule, which is a terrible thing to have in a financial regulation law. And I don't necessarily know that the conflict minerals rule either should have been passed or maybe handled in some other way, but it was in there, okay. And I also have no illusions that the Dodd-Frank Act did turn a blind eye to one big part of why the financial crisis happened in 2008, which was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac playing an overly important role in housing finance in the mortgage industry. A lot of conservatives will say that is the true problem, and Dodd-Frank didn't address it. They're correct. It did not. But another big problem that did happen was that there was systemic risks that were being taken by big, huge financial firms, and they required bailouts. And Dodd-Frank did address that. I think the reason I wrote the column is just within the space of 24 hours, I saw two different examples of how the consequences of that law are now playing out. Number one, GE Financial trying to shed all of its operations so that GE as a whole is no longer a systemically important financial institution. That's the lovely acronym, SIFI, that if you are a SIFI, you have extra financial regulations imposed on you because you're so big and so important. GE should not necessarily be a big financial firm. It should not require that, but GE Capital is huge. GE Capital would be the seventh largest bank in the country if it were independent. Of course, it is a SIFI, so GE as a whole said, we don't want that. We're going to try and dump GE Financial to get it out of our balance sheet. What did anybody think would happen years before when they passed the Dodd-Frank Act? But this is not necessarily a bad thing. This is a big industrial company, doesn't understand financial risks as well as certainly other big financial firms. So GE is saying we're getting out of the systemic risk business. Let the banks handle it. Let the private equity firms handle it. This is what they are equipped to do. So I saw nothing surprising about that, and I would say GE dumping GE Financial is an example of Dodd-Frank fulfilling its mission, for better or worse, but it is. At the same time, we also saw a new study saying that the majority of mortgage debt now owned in this country is owned by shadow banks, which are not in the financial system, and they are not governed by the Dodd-Frank law because they're not really financial firms. They might be more like private equity funds or other sorts of pools of asset management money that, they're not overseen by the Fed. Could they become a big systemic risk? Possibly. And again, it points to how Dodd-Frank fell short because it did not get to this total solution of addressing systemic risk. It addressed some systemic risks. It did not address systemic risk as a whole problem and say we're going to attack it wherever it might show up. It only said we're going to attack it in certain ways at really big financial firms so we won't have to bail them out. I'm not necessarily saying Dodd-Frank, therefore, is working or not, or working well or working bad, but it was an imperfect law and is therefore working imperfectly. Sometimes it has its good days. Sometimes you see consequences that are bad days. So happened I saw two of them at the same day, good and bad. But eventually I think Congress will need to tackle more of the systemic risk problem. I'm somewhat dubious that Congress will be able to do that. Certainly I don't think Republicans, as much as they complain about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they don't really have an idea of how to get rid of them. Nor do I think that the Democrats really have much interest in addressing some problems, such as there are large segments of the population that should not be thrown into the housing market. They don't have the income or the assets to buy large homes. And that is what got us into this problem in the first place. It was a mix of Republicans turning blind eyes and Democrats turning blind eyes. And so it struck me that day. That's where that column came from.
Well, it was interesting that you had such a dichotomy of fallout or results from Dodd-Frank, and that they came together within 24 hours. Certainly the GE Capital sale made a lot of press here, and then the article in the Financial Times also should have gotten more readership here, but certainly interesting that its financial services industry is moving to a area that is much less regulated, and I'm sure at some point that's going to have to be addressed as well.
Probably, yes.
So let me turn a little bit to something a little bit different, which is Compliance Week conferences in the fall of 2015. You've got some exciting events coming up, so could you tell us, give us a little preview?
Sure, yeah. So we have two international conferences happening this year. First, coming up in October in Brussels, we will have our third annual Europe conference. That is going to be October 26 and 27, and we are off to a very strong start planning that out and gaming it out. We will have a keynote speaker of David Green, who is the director of the Serious Fraud Office in the UK. We also will have the deputy director of OECD, who will also be a keynote speaker. We've got a couple of different sessions looking at the same sort of compliance problems that large companies face anywhere, but with a certain European flair. Certainly, for example, we have sessions about cultivating a speak-up culture that is much more difficult to do in Europe than it is over in North America. We have more discussions about cybersecurity and privacy, where they are certainly much more attuned and more sensitive to those issues in Europe, given their past histories and just generally more cultural sensitivity around privacy in Europe. One interesting thing I hope somebody will ask David Green while he's speaking, or maybe it will come up generally in our conference, is the question of personal liability for chief compliance officers. I know
Right.
It's getting a lot of press here in the United States. There's a lot of noise, but not much substance to that issue here in the U.S., I think, especially for your listeners who are from many different industries worried about anti-bribery. Very different story in the UK in particular, where they have already charged the former head of ethics and compliance at Alstom, who had been very well known in the European ethics and compliance community. And now he has been implicated for charges. I'm not entirely clear what the SFO's legal theory is here, but I'm going to ask them just about, what are the failures to prevent bribery and corruption? Are we really going to start charging people? The Alstom executive in question is Jean-Daniel Launay, who worked at Alstom for 40 years. He's spoken at all sorts of conferences, not a compliance week, but I do know of him, and I know other people who know him well. They are all astonished that he might have somehow be sucked into the Alstom vortex. So I think there will be a lot of discussion at our conference in Europe on that issue generally. That's the Europe event. And then in November, on November 17, we will have a one-day conference in Dubai. That is going to be the first time Compliance Week has had an event in the Middle East. We will probably tilt a bit more to issues in tune for financial services companies, given their preponderance over in the Dubai economy. But a lot about anti-money laundering, a lot about due diligence and knowing your customer. Certainly a lot with working with emerging markets, since that's pretty much the entire Middle East area. And that's should be a very interesting one as well. You can see all of the information about all of these conferences on our website, which is conference.complianceweek.com. Our 2016 conference here in the U.S. is just in its formative stages. We do have our advisory board, and we've got a couple of ideas, but we'll be talking much more about that later on in the fall and into early next year as we gear up for that. But that's what's going on.
Well, I'd be very interested to hear what David Green might say, because the topic of the Alstom CCO being indicted, really without any of the information that you would typically see in the United States as to the charges, I know it's been a great topic of conversation. And while the SEC has made a few inroads into that area, I really think it has more to do with the regulated nature of the financial services industry than the chief compliance officer role as a whole. But it's out there, so we'll just have to see what the facts might be and where it may go.
I did want to just take a minute to say here in the U.S., everybody does talk about chief compliance officer liability. I think within a very narrow confines of, like you said, broker-dealers, registered investment advisors, and other financial advisors like that, it can be a real issue. I do not necessarily know if I think the SEC, when it is enforcing in that narrow field, if it's always a good idea to be going after CCOs, as they seem to be doing these days. I do think for everybody outside of it, you don't need to panic about these things. And I did get a kick out of one story I saw just yesterday that the SEC barred the president of an investment advisory firm and fined the firm $285,000 for ignoring the chief compliance officer and his pleas for help. So I'm sure all of your listeners and my readers will be doing handsprings later on today. We'll have that story on our website later on as well. But like I said, there's a lot of noise around that issue here in the United States. I'm not sure how much real substance there is, but it is what it is.
Well, Matt, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, but thank you very much for coming on. Always a pleasure and always informative. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, Tom. Always good to talk to you, too.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. If I could give a couple of calls of action to you, I would appreciate if you would go to iTunes and rate this podcast. That would certainly help us moving forward. The second thing is I am developing a list of questions for my next mailbag episode. So if you have any questions, I hope you will email them to me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you on the next episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.